Welcome to this channel. Today, we discuss the history of President Idi Amin of Uganda, a history of torture, cannibalism. Idi Amin Dada rose from humble beginnings to become the president of Uganda, a title that soon became synonymous with fear and brutality. This is his story, a narrative of power, ambition, and the darkness that consumed his soul. Idi Amin was born in Kiboko, a small village in northwest Uganda, in 1925. His early years were marked by poverty, but he was determined to rise above his circumstances. He joined the King's African Rifles, the British colonial army, in 1946, starting a journey that would lead him to the pinnacle of power. The army became his school. He was a quick learner, mastering military tactics and earning promotions through his prowess. By the time Uganda gained independence in 1962, he was a formidable force in the military, a key figure in the newly established Ugandan army. His loyalty to the British during the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya and his service in the British campaign in Burma during World War II earned him recognition and advancement. In 1971, Amin saw his opportunity. President Milton Obote was out of the country, and Amin launched a coup d'état, seizing control of the government. The people welcomed him initially, tired of Obote's policies. He promised them prosperity and security, but his real intentions were far more sinister. With power firmly in his grasp, Amin began to rule with an iron fist. His paranoia grew, and he saw enemies everywhere. The first to feel his wrath were soldiers loyal to Obote. Thousands were executed, their bodies dumped into the Nile. This was just the beginning. Amin declared himself president for life, and his regime became increasingly brutal. Anyone who opposed him was eliminated. Politicians, journalists, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were all targets. His secret police, the State Research Bureau, carried out these atrocities, ensuring that dissent was crushed. Under Amin's rule, summary executions became commonplace. Military barracks, prisons, and secret locations across Uganda were sites of unimaginable brutality. Soldiers, often under direct orders from Amin, carried out executions with ruthless efficiency. The Nile became a dumping ground for countless bodies, a stark reminder of the regime's terror. The disappearances were just as terrifying. People would be taken from their homes, workplaces, or even public spaces, never to be seen again. The State Research Bureau, Amin's notorious secret police, was responsible for these abductions. Families lived in constant fear, knowing that a knock on the door could mean the end for their loved ones. Amin's regime utilized torture chambers to instill fear and punish those who were deemed enemies of the state. These chambers, often hidden in military installations or secret police headquarters, were sites of unspeakable horror. Victims were subjected to brutal beatings, electric shocks, and other forms of torture designed to break both body and spirit. In 1972, Amin made a decision that would devastate Uganda's economy. He expelled over 50,000 Asians, primarily Indians, who controlled much of the country's commerce. He accused them of exploiting Ugandans, but his true motive was to seize their businesses and properties. This action led to economic collapse, as there were no skilled Ugandans to replace them. Amin's reign was also marked by ethnic cleansing. He targeted the Akoli and Lengo ethnic groups, from which many of Obote's supporters hailed. Entire villages were massacred. The military and secret police carried out these genocidal actions with brutal efficiency, leaving behind a trail of destruction and death. Among the many horrifying allegations against Amin were those of cannibalism. Witnesses and defectors from his inner circle claimed that Amin not only ordered the killings of his enemies, but also partook in their flesh. These stories painted a picture of a man who had descended into a depth of barbarism rarely seen in modern history. It was said that Amin kept severed heads in his freezer, preserving them as trophies of his power. He reportedly boasted about his taste for human flesh, claiming it gave him strength. While some of these stories might be exaggerated or fueled by the desire to demonize him further, they contributed to his image as a monstrous ruler. Amin's atrocities extended beyond the physical torture and execution of his enemies. His psychological torment was equally devastating. He would often summon the families of his victims, forcing them to watch as their loved ones were tortured or executed. This cruelty knew no bounds, as Amin delighted in the suffering and fear he could instill in others. Amin's actions earned him international condemnation. He was dubbed the Butcher of Uganda, and his country became isolated. Relations with neighboring Tanzania deteriorated, leading to a war in 1978. Amin's forces invaded Tanzania, but the Tanzanian army, along with Ugandan exiles, pushed them back. The international community, shocked by reports of Amin's brutality, including allegations of cannibalism, further isolated his regime. Foreign aid dwindled, and Uganda's economy spiraled into further disarray. In April 1979, the combined Tanzanian and Ugandan forces captured Kampala. Amin's regime crumbled, and he fled into exile, first to Libya, then Iraq, and finally Saudi Arabia. However, before he settled in Saudi Arabia, Amin made a stop in Nigeria. When Amin fled Uganda, he sought refuge in various countries. One notable stop was Nigeria. Upon his arrival, the Nigerian government faced immense pressure from both the international community and its own citizens. Stories of Amin's atrocities, including allegations of cannibalism, had spread far and wide, making his presence in Nigeria highly controversial. Nigerians were outraged. Protests erupted, with citizens demanding that Amin be expelled from their country. The Nigerian government, led by then-President Olusegun Obasanjo, faced a difficult decision. Hosting Amin, even temporarily, was a diplomatic nightmare and a moral quandary. Under intense pressure, President Obasanjo ultimately decided to send Amin away. This decision was influenced by the volatile public sentiment and the desire to maintain Nigeria's international reputation. Amin was forced to leave Nigeria, eventually finding refuge in Saudi Arabia, where he would spend the remainder of his life in relative obscurity. In Saudi Arabia, Amin lived a quiet life compared to his tumultuous rule in Uganda. The Saudi government provided him with a stipend and a residence in the coastal city of Jeddah. He lived under the watchful eyes of Saudi authorities, who restricted his movements and kept him away from political activities. During his years in exile, Amin was often seen in Jeddah, living a life of relative comfort. Despite being away from power, his presence remained a symbol of fear for many Ugandans who had fled his regime. Reports indicate that Amin remained unapologetic about his actions, often justifying his brutal rule as necessary for maintaining order and control. As Amin sat in his final years, far from the land he once ruled, he reflected on his life. He had risen to power with the dreams of a nation behind him, only to become a tyrant who brought suffering and death to countless people. History remembers him as a monster, a dictator whose thirst for power led to untold misery. Amin's legacy is one of horror and tragedy. His rise to power was marked by ambition and military prowess, but his reign was defined by brutality, paranoia, and a complete disregard for human life. The stories of his atrocities serve as a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the dangers of absolute power. To understand Idi Amin's brutality, let's dive into his atrocities in details. Idi Amin's regime was responsible for numerous massacres across Uganda. One of the most notorious was the massacre at the Uganda-Tanzania border. In 1971, shortly after taking power, Amin ordered the execution of soldiers suspected of being loyal to Obo. These soldiers were lined up along the banks of the Nile and shot, their bodies discarded into the river. This massacre was a warning to any who might oppose Amin's rule. Another horrific event was the massacre at the Jinja military barracks in 1972. Soldiers and civilians accused of plotting against Amin were tortured and executed. The barracks became synonymous with death, a place where screams of agony were commonplace. Survivors of these atrocities describe a scene of unimaginable horror, with bodies piled high and blood staining the grounds. Amin's torture chambers were a central tool in his campaign of terror. Located in various secret police headquarters and military installations, these chambers were equipped with instruments designed to inflict maximum pain. Victims were subjected to electric shocks, beatings, and mutilation. The torturers, often under direct orders from Amin, showed no mercy. One infamous torture site was the Makindye military prison. Prisoners were held in appalling conditions, often starved and beaten daily. Torture methods included hanging prisoners by their feet, administering electric shocks, and breaking bones with heavy objects. The psychological torment was equally severe, with victims forced to listen to the screams of others being tortured. Amin's regime targeted specific ethnic groups in a campaign of ethnic cleansing. The Akoli and Lengo people, many of whom supported Obo, were singled out for extermination. Entire villages were destroyed and thousands of people were killed. The military and secret police carried out these genocidal actions with brutal efficiency, leaving behind a trail of destruction and death. One of the most chilling aspects of Amin's ethnic cleansing was the way it was carried out. Soldiers would arrive in villages, often in the middle of the night, rounding up men, women, and children. Those who resisted were shot on the spot. Others were taken away to undisclosed locations where they were tortured and eventually killed. Bodies were often dumped in mass graves or left to rot in public areas as a grim warning to others. In 1974, a particularly brutal massacre occurred in the West Nile region. Amin's forces targeted the local population, primarily composed of the Kakwa, Nubians, and Aller ethnic groups, accusing them of disloyalty. Thousands were killed, and entire communities were obliterated. Survivors recall the horror of watching their family members being butchered and their homes burned to the ground. Amin's reign of terror was not limited to secretive acts of violence. He frequently used public executions as a method of instilling fear and demonstrating his power. Stadiums and public squares were often the sites of these gruesome spectacles, where crowds were forced to watch as alleged traitors and dissidents were executed. One of the most infamous public executions took place in 1977 at the University of Makerere. Several university lecturers and students, accused of conspiring against Amin, were publicly hanged. The event was broadcast on national television, sending a clear message that no one was safe from Amin's wrath. Amin's psychological warfare extended to his own government and military. He routinely purged high-ranking officials and military officers whom he suspected of plotting against him. These purges were often brutal and public, serving as both punishment and a deterrent to others. The constant state of fear and paranoia within Amin's inner circle created an atmosphere of distrust and instability. In August 1972, Amin announced the expulsion of the Asian community from Uganda. This decision was driven by a combination of xenophobia, economic opportunism, and Amin's desire to consolidate power. The expulsion targeted over 50,000 Asians, primarily of Indian descent, who had lived in Uganda for generations and controlled a significant portion of the country's economy. Amin accused the Asians of exploiting Ugandans and hoarding wealth. He gave them 90 days to leave the country, allowing them to take only personal belongings and a minimal amount of cash. Businesses, homes, and other assets were seized by the state, often redistributed to Amin's loyalists and cronies. The expulsion had devastating consequences for Uganda's economy. The sudden removal of skilled and experienced business owners led to a collapse in commerce and industry. Shops, factories, and farms were left abandoned or fell into disrepair under the management of inexperienced Ugandans who were unprepared to take over these enterprises. The economic void left by the expelled Asians contributed to widespread poverty and hunger. In 1978, Amin made a fatal mistake by invading Tanzania. The conflict began over a border dispute, but Amin's decision to launch an unprovoked attack on Tanzanian territory was largely driven by his delusions of grandeur and a desire to distract from internal problems. His forces captured the town of Kagera, prompting a swift and decisive response from the Tanzanian government. President Julius Nyerere of Tanzania mobilized his military, which, along with Ugandan exiles, launched a counteroffensive. The war was short but brutal. Amin's poorly trained and ill-equipped troops were no match for the Tanzanian forces. By April 1979, the combined Tanzanian and Ugandan rebel forces had captured Kampala, and Amin's regime fell. The fall of Amin marked the end of one of the most brutal dictatorships in African history. However, the damage inflicted on Uganda during his reign left deep scars. The country was left in economic ruin, with infrastructure destroyed and institutions weakened. The social fabric of the nation had been torn apart by years of violence and terror. The human cost of Amin's rule was staggering. It is estimated that between 100,000 and 500,000 people were killed during his 8-year regime. The true number may never be known, as many bodies were never recovered and records were often destroyed. After Amin's fall, Uganda faced the daunting task of rebuilding. The new government, led initially by Yusuf Lul and later by Godfrey Bainiza and Milton Obote, who returned to power, struggled to restore stability and address the legacy of Amin's atrocities. The country went through a period of continued conflict and political instability, including a civil war that saw further suffering and loss of life. After fleeing Uganda, Amin found temporary refuge in Libya and Iraq before finally settling in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi government granted him asylum on the condition that he remain out of politics and refrain from engaging in any activities that could cause embarrassment to his hosts. Idi Amin's legacy is one of horror and tragedy. His rise to power was marked by ambition and military prowess, but his reign was defined by brutality, paranoia, and a complete disregard for human life. The stories of his atrocities serve as a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the dangers of absolute power. The impact of Amin's rule on Uganda was profound. The country's economy, social fabric, and international reputation were severely damaged. The ethnic and political divisions he exacerbated continued to affect Uganda long after his fall from power. Amin's rule also left a lasting impact on the broader African continent. His regime became a symbol of the excesses and abuses of post-colonial African dictatorships. The international community's response to Amin's atrocities highlighted the challenges of addressing human rights abuses and holding dictators accountable. As history continues to judge Amin, it is important to remember the countless victims of his regime and the enduring impact of his actions on Uganda and the world. The lessons of Amin's rule must not be forgotten, lest we allow similar horrors to occur again. For more documentary histories, kindly subscribe to this channel, like and share.